Hey guys, I know this is a different setup. I am on the floor in my guest room slash office, and we are going to do some work on the whiteboard today. I'm going to do some notes. You can take some notes along with me. I am really excited to start Unit 3. I love teaching argumentation. It is such an essential skill for obviously college life, but definitely beyond college life. And so especially right now with it being election season, this is really the time to understand how to both analyze arguments and be able to formulate strong argumentation as well. So let's get started. For homework last night, you guys were supposed to have read over the chart on argumentation, persuasion, and propaganda. I really think that it's helpful to start the conversation about argumentation by looking at what it is and what it isn't. So there are a couple things that I want to highlight just from those notes. The first is that argument ultimately deals with an attempt to discover truth. And often the argument that you write itself is not truth. It's an attempt at discovering a truth, or it's an attempt at providing evidence for a potential truth, right? And truth is sort of different for everyone. So, and based on the evidence that you're finding. And truth is also something that evolves over time. And is a sort of a product of its time. So that's sort of where Kairos comes in as well. So that's what argument is concerned with. And some other things argument as a genre is always concerned with is that it always considers different perspectives. That is not an option in argumentation. Okay, so some of y'all may be familiar with the term counterclaim. I'm going to talk to you today about concession refutation, which is counterclaim, but just in a little bit of a different way. And then, that's essentially where those different perspectives come from. Now, what I don't want to mislead you with, now that you're in college, we're not necessarily looking at pro-con arguments, okay? We are looking at argumentation that is demonstrates critical thinking and shows you that there are actually multiple perspectives, right? Not just one or two. It's not an either or sort of dichotomy in academic argumentation. And so you want to consider that as well. And I'm going to show you some examples in just a minute that'll help with this. Arguments always provide logical evidence. So opinion pieces or persuasive pieces will often blend logical and emotional appeals. In fact, persuasion does not even have to cite any logical evidence in order to be persuasive. That's why persuasion can be so dangerous, because we tend to be able to rely on emotions like fear in order to convince people to believe the way we do. So what marks argument as different is that the evidence used is logical, right? So it's from credible sources. People cite authority as evidence. It might even be historical allusions, right, or historical context, all of these kinds of things. But the evidence also needs to be cited, and there needs to be credibility to that evidence as well. And then lastly, something that argument should do is predict the consequences of accepting an argument. So at some point, and generally this happens in the conclusion, the writer or the speaker or the reader has to understand or express to the reader or the audience that, look, I understand there could be consequences of accepting this position, and these are those consequences, but it's still ultimately the best for this situation. So if you think about Dr. Hannah Atisha from Unit 1, her argument essentially is look at the lead level data, and let's make a decision about what we're going to do about the water systems in Flint, Michigan. Yes, the consequence will be that the new water systems will be expensive, right? But at the end of the day, what those consequences pale in comparison to the health of Flint's children, right? So anticipating the consequences of accepting an argument are also important and can be done throughout an argument paper, not just in the conclusion, but that's where you'll often see that. Right, I'm going to talk about the argument notes. You can find these notes in Blackboard. They'll be listed as argument notes. And these are the basic parts of argumentation. So I'm just going to kind of roll through these. Please feel free to take notes as I go through. So we look at the classical argument scheme in this class. This is also known as the Ciceronian argument. There are a number of different types of argumentation, and you can look those up on your own. But essentially, we use sort of the basic argument scheme. The basic scheme starts with an intro that seeks to engage audiences. I mean, this is kind of a normal writing technique. And then it also seeks to build credibility for the writer, which would be you. And you do that through having a tone that is both assertive and objective. Okay, let's just talk about what those mean and what they don't mean. Okay, assertive means that you have a strong position. Assertive is not the same as aggressive. Aggressive starts to get into emotional territory. So if you're angry when you're making your argument, you're already going to dissuade your audience, right? We don't tend to react well to someone's anger, especially if they have a position that's maybe a little different than the one that we would normally take on. However, assertiveness shows a certain confidence in writing. So you want to keep that in mind. And then our tone being objective. Objective just means non-biased. And you can do that easily by making sure that you are noting counterclaims. So being assertive, being objective, that helps build your credibility. And also any sources that you, even if you are starting to use sources in your introduction, making sure that you build their credibility by referencing their professional expertise or authority or whatever. Okay, and then the intro will also state a claim. And the claim needs to be also assertive. So instead of something like, I think that this is this and this, right? You just state your position. And then it should also be arguable, right? So ultimately, someone should be able to argue against your claim. Otherwise, it's not an argumentative claim, okay? So you'll keep that in mind. When we move past the introduction, then we get to what we call confirmation. This is your evidence, okay? So these are your reasons and evidence. And your reasons and evidence should come from strong, credible sources and should rely on logic, right? So these logical appeals, facts from research, statistics, quotes from authority, quotes from, trusted reports. This is essential in argumentation, especially academic level argumentation, but it should be in any. Now, you should not rely on emotional appeals. So say you're writing about something and you want to give your personal perspective. That would be okay for this paper if it's used as an introduction technique to engage your audience. Okay, so a personal story is great. That brings the audience into the discussion. But once you start building that evidence for your argumentation, that needs to be logical. Okay, if it's emotional, then your argument becomes less trustworthy. The other thing to consider is sometimes logical evidence is inherently emotional, okay? And that's not a problem. What I mean by that is take Hannah Atisha's book, her discussing these things about the lead being in the bottles of these babies, right? And they're mixed with their formula and all of that stuff. That's actually factual, right? But it also is inherently emotional. We connect to that. So sometimes your logical evidence will be emotional. If that's the case, that's fine, as long as, again, there's logic there and that there's no fallacy, which you'll be learning about fallacy in your argument modules. Okay, so we have claim and evidence, basically. Okay, what else does an argument need? Remember, an argument has to consider multiple perspectives. For some of you, if you're more comfortable with the word counterclaim, that's fine. So counterclaim. A counterclaim does often suggest sort of a pro-con or like one opposing view. I like to refer to this, and in the classical scheme, it's referred to as concession and refutation. All right, so concession means that you concede a different perspective. This is also sometimes called the yes, ... but technique, which I know that sounds weird, but I'll show you what this means. So take Hannah Atisha, right? So from What the Eyes Don't See. She says, yes, replacing the water system is costly, right? So she's admitting, especially to those in power who are trying to use this as an excuse to keep the water like it is and to hide the blood lead levels research and all of that. She's admitting, okay, it is expensive, right? She is conceding that point, but she does not stop there. A concession is nothing in argumentation without the refutation, okay? But research suggests, so we always love that our refutations be factual, right? Research suggests these huge health risks. And ultimately money, pales in comparison to the health of Flint, Michigan citizens, right? So when you consider multiple perspectives, you have to be prepared, first of all, for that different perspective, the one that someone's going to, take with your argument and say, now wait a minute, what about this? You are showing them, I'm not scared of your opposing view or your different perspective. I understand it because I've done enough research to see that. My point here is this, right? My refutation based on research shows that this different perspective, it pales in comparison to what my research suggests. This builds your credibility as a writer to be able to do this. All right, and lastly, we have conclusions. And guys, I know I'm going sort of in an order of like intro to conclusion, and sometimes that confuses students and they feel like the concession refutation part has to come toward the end. It doesn't. Concession refutation can be a part of an argument all the way through. In fact, you can even set up your claim as a concession refutation, where the claim is the refutation of a common misconception or different perspective. But last here, we're going to look at conclusions. And to be honest, in argumentation, conclusions often look to the future. So whereas the argumentation itself, the kairos of it is sort of the present, the problem, right? The conclusion is looking to the future. In other words, if you're taking my claim into consideration in this, dense evidence that I've provided, this is what we now need to do with this problem, right? So a lot of times they're solution driven. They may be calls to action. So there may not be an apparent solution, but a need for action. Even like rhetorical questions can be used as concluding techniques. So there are lots of things here that you can do in argumentation. So why are we talking about all the argument stuff, particularly, you know, how an argument's made right now, which is when we're at the very earliest stages of this unit? Well, we need to be able to analyze arguments before we start writing them, okay? So for the next week or so, we're going to be listening to and reading different arguments as you are starting to research your own research questions, which I'll go over the assignment sheet, well, right now, actually. And then we're going to analyze our first argument together. So if you would like to take a break, this is going to be a rather long video. Go ahead and take your break now and come back to this sort of fresh, and we will discuss the research argument assignment. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, we'll enter full screen. Okay, so this is our first part of, enter full screen. There we go. All right, so this is part one of our Unit 3 argument assignments. We're going to do two different assignments, okay? The first part here is called the research journey assignment. This is a part, it's a bit more informal. It's where you are going to talk us as a class through your research question and the different sources that you have found that align with your research question. So I'm going to go over this real quickly. I'm going to show you a couple of resources, and then you guys can follow the calendar and you'll see how we're going to do sort of little steps of this project at a time. So up here I have a quote from von Braun. Y'all know how I like to start with epigraphs. I always love this quote: research is what I'm doing when I don't know what I'm doing, right? A lot of students, when they go into this unit, they're just like, how do I come up with an argument question, you know, a research question? I don't know what to write about. You know, generally a teacher is going to give that to me and just tell me what to do. You know, research, the part where we read and we just digest tons of different sources and material, that's what tells us what we're doing, right? We don't know that before we go into the research itself. So what you guys are going to have to do a lot of in the next week is a lot of reading and just seeing what's out there and what you care enough about to write about. So here's the context of the assignment. I'll just read for you real quick. It says, this unit is all about how academic writers enter a research realm. To do that, the writing starts with inquiry. Inquiry, you know, is a question. Asking questions is essential to academic writing because researchers aren't writing what they already know. They're contributing to a conversation that is already happening and that still has a way to go. The research will ultimately end in an argument paper where you make a claim on an issue of your choosing and provide logical evidence for those claims. Okay, so that's going to be part 2 of this assignment. Part 1 is the research itself. So the sources that you're reading, what they're telling you, what you might use from those sources when you start to formulate your argument, etc. Okay. So your task for this, you're going to actually create a video, a 10-minute max video. And we are going to use the program Flipgrid to do this. Okay. I actually have already recorded a video. Sorry, it's making me log in again. So that you can see my video as a sample. Sorry, I just changed my password. Y'all know how that is. You got to log into everything again. There we go. All right. So these are going to be our research journey projects. You guys are all in this program, so you can go to it, link into it from our assignment sheet whenever you're ready. And what you'll do is record your response here. And it's pretty simple. I mean, I had to do it a few times just because I was getting used to sort of the hang of it. But your video will end up being about 10 minutes where you just kind of trace your research journey. Okay, so let's go back to the assignment sheet. All right, so in your video, this is what you're going to discuss, this 1 through 5, okay? Number 1, you'll introduce yourself, your research question, and what source really inspired your interest in the research question. So if you go back and watch my model, which we'll be doing in the next couple classes, but you're welcome to do anytime, my sample is looking at the health benefits of being in nature. Okay, so my research question is, what are the health benefits of being in nature and how can we make it accessible to all? Okay, and then I talk about the source that really inspired my research, which was actually a podcast that I listen to fairly regularly. So I bring that up. And then number 2, you're going to discuss 3 sources that answer your research question. Okay, and it's okay if the first source is your inspiration source that you talk about. That's fine. You're going to talk about a number of things, like how did you find this source? Is this just something you normally listen to and so it sparked your attention? Is this something you had to look up through the library's database? Is this something that you did a Google search on or that you asked an expert on? Or did you watch a documentary? What are the ways in which you found this source? You'll discuss some brief biographical info, so just kind of looking at the source credibility, why this source is credible. Obviously, if it's just some website that you Googled and it doesn't have an author listed or a publisher information that's credible, then that's a problem, right? And you probably shouldn't use that website, but it could give you some information that you could then go in and look for different search, do some different Google searches or Google Scholar searches or OneSearch searches and look for more. But keep that in mind, that credibility of those sources is essential. And then what specifically from the source you might want to use in the paper. So you can even highlight if you wanted to. You could pull up the source because in Flipgrid you can actually share your screen like here in Zoom. You can pull up the source, you can highlight the information that you want to potentially use in your paper. You may not use it, but what from the source stood out to you the most. And notice here in this project, at least one of the sources needs to be a scholarly source. So it needs to be a peer-reviewed academic source, like a journal article would be an example of that. You'll also talk about what we call one roadblock source. So this goes back to those multiple perspectives that are so important in argumentation. I say here, remember to avoid those pro, con, or dichotomy views, and instead think about multiple perspectives. So about your research, what might a social scientist say? What might an economist say? Or a psychologist say, right? So for the Hannah Atisha work, the environmental data and the health data was really compelling, but what about the economic side of this problem as well, right? So you might want to look at sort of this different field of study when considering your roadblock source or sort of your differing perspective. Your video is going to end with your working claim at this point. And then the last slide will be what we call a gaps in research slide, which is where you admit to the audience, which is us, me and your peers and Miss Black. You're going to admit to us, okay, there's still work I need to do. Like I need some more research in this area. So as far as how you talk to your audience, let this be a pretty informal conversation among your academic peers. Okay, now I know seeing informal and academic in the same sentence can throw you off, but we're all academic peers, me, you, Miss Black, your classmates. When we get together and we're just talking, we're just spitballing, okay, these are ideas I have about my research, what do you think? Those conversations can be informal, right? As we start to actually write the research paper, our tone gets much more formal. So for this assignment, you're just talking. You're talking to the screen and you're sharing your research. So let that be informal. That's okay, you know, as you kind of trace us through. You want to express to your audience what inspired the research, what you gained from researching, where you're headed with the big paper, what those gaps are that you know are there. And if you just need more information on what your tone should be, just look at my example on the health benefits from nature. Okay. Requirements: the project will be recorded and posted via Flipgrid. You do need to weave, instead of it just being, I would share your screen in your video instead of it just being you speaking. And that way, as the audience is listening to the video, they can also see your research and give you feedback that way. And again, you can see that in my example. The scoring considerations here, we will also look at those when we do a peer review on this part 1, which you'll see the dates for that in your calendar. Okay, so if you have any other questions about those, just come see us during office hours or set up a Zoom meeting with Ms. Black or myself, and we can go through it. Don't forget too, the Writing Center can be an excellent resource for helping you analyze an assignment sheet. Okay. All right. If you want to, again, take a break, because we're going to do one more thing together. So I know this is a longer video, then use this time to take a break while I pull up what's next. All right. So I'm going to take some notes for us on this argument, and the link is in your calendar. But this is NPR, you know, we're using that as our textbook. These are weekly arguments that are, actually, I'll share my screen for this. This is going to be better that way. Okay. They are recorded by Scott Simon, who is a just prolific journalist and author. He has covered, you can see this is his bio in NPR. He has won multiple awards for journalism. It says up here he's reported from 50 states, 5 continents, 10 wars. He's written books about war and peace, sports and art. I mean, just very eclectic sort of writing. That just won a number of awards. One guy, he's a journalist for The Post, calls Scott Simon the most literate, witty, moving, and just plain interesting news show on any dial. Sorry, not Simon, but his program, Weekend Edition, which comes on Saturdays. So Scott Simon does each week what I call these little 2-minute arguments. They're really quick. And because they have to be so quick, you have to take that into consideration as you're sort of analyzing those arguments. But it's great to use to do a quick analysis of an argument. So what we're going to do is we're going to listen to this. And as we listen, I want you to take notes, okay, on a couple things. We're going to look at how does he introduce? What is his claim? What evidence is he providing? How does he address opposing views or multiple perspectives, so concession refutation? And how does he conclude? Okay, and we're looking at that from a writer's perspective, so we're really analyzing these writer's moves. As he's speaking, I will also have the transcript playing here so you can read along.
Is named for Confederate officers who took up arms against the United States. Why are there U.S. military bases named for Confederate officers who took up arms against the United States? I've covered stories at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where the 18th Airborne Corps is headquartered, and Fort Benning, Georgia, known as the home of the infantry. Those bases were not founded in the wake of the Civil War, and President Lincoln encouraged national conciliation. Fort Benning and Fort Bragg were opened in 1918 as the U.S. Army expanded to fight World War I. Harold Holzer, the Civil War historian and author at Hunter College, told us that the Army essentially gave what we'd now call naming rights to states to help the federal government acquire the land. And of course, the U.S. Army of 1918 was segregated. Brigadier General Henry L. Benning was acclaimed as Old Rock by his men. He once had 2 horses shot out from under him in battle. Harold Holzer calls him, quote, a pretty formidable military commander, that is, effective in the war to perpetuate slavery. More to the point, he was a virulent white supremacist who issued incendiary warnings about the so-called dangers of having free black men outnumbering white men and threatening the purity of lily white womanhood. Harold Holzer, says Braxton Bragg, quote, may have been the worst commanding general in the Confederacy. He was a bad strategist, an inept tactician whose usual order was to charge straight ahead. He did absolutely nothing to establish a claim to a place in national or even Southern memory. I just find it mystifying, he says, that 2 iconic American Army installations should have been named in honor of a racist and a screw-up. Braxton Bragg, will add, may have qualified as both. Elizabeth Samet, the professor of English at West Point and author of A Soldier's Heart, told us that putting new names on military bases wouldn't erase America's history, because those old Confederate names and memorial statues were part of what we'd now call a rebranding effort in the early 20th century to erase the true history that the Confederacy fought the war to retain slavery. And of course, the South also lost. Elizabeth Samet says, there were so many men and women, white, Native American, Asian American, Latino, and Black, who fought for and even gave their lives for the United States. The names of true heroes on our Army bases would better honor the men and women who serve today.
All right. So there is the, let's go now to full screen. Stop sharing. All right. So there was the, I'm going to get this full screen. I'm sorry, guys. There we go. The argument, Scott Simon's argument on renaming some military bases, particularly Fort Bragg. So his claim is ultimately that we need to rename Bragg and Fort Benning. And ultimately to better honor the diverse military men and women who've served throughout history in our U.S. military. Okay. Now, I didn't talk about Kairos. Kairos is everything, right? Kairos is why we're writing about these, or why this argument's even coming up. Now, Simon does not talk about that himself. It's something he could have, especially in the introduction. He could have talked about, in light of a lot of movements around the country this year to take down Confederate monuments, to remove names of Confederate generals, etc. That a lot of that is sparked by a lot of the racial tension that we're seeing in the country right now. Some people could even argue sparked by the murder of George Floyd early summer, that then it could build that Kairos. But that's the moment we're in, right? And actually at the University of Mississippi, we've been in that moment for 2 decades, basically, as we've been doing a lot of work on racial reconciliation on our campuses as well, including the removal of the Confederate monument from our circle, which has just happened. So if you're thinking about Kairos, this really plays into that. And renaming is something that we're seeing happening across the country right now in different places, and even initiatives to do that, even if they're not currently happening, but these initiatives getting those started. So that's sort of the Kairos of the time. Now, the introduction, though, he uses a rhetorical question, and it was, why did we name these 2 bases after these 2 men? Okay, so it's a very simple kind of introductory technique. Asking the question engages the audience into thinking about it, and more than likely folks who don't know much about this would say, well, if a military base is named after 2 men, it's because they were great men. They were heroes in their own right. And so that's where the evidence comes in. If we look back, let me share my screen again real quick. If we look back at the transcript here, he ends up talking to us from the perspective of Harold Holzer, and he's citing authority here, a Civil War historian and author at Hunter College, who went into sort of the background of Benning and Bragg, two leaders, Confederate leaders, generals, who were not necessarily, if you look at them from a historical perspective, not necessarily the kind of heroes that we would want to be representative of the U.S. military today, particularly because Benning was a noted white supremacist. And then Bragg was not necessarily a strong general at all. And so he's using this authority to make this argument, right? He says, I find it mystifying that Holzer says that two iconic American Army installations could have been named in honor of a racist and a screw up. And he says that Bragg could have actually qualified as both, right? So his evidence is from Holzer, if you're kind of taking notes here, who is a Civil War historian and professor. And he's questioning the heroics of Bragg and Benning, right? And not just questioning the heroics, he's also pointing out their records, particularly with Benning, who was a noted white supremacist and wrote about segregation and separation and these sorts of things. Okay, on top of being generals for the Confederacy, which of course was lost the war. And if we go back to the introduction, this is something that Simon says too, why are U.S. military bases named for Confederate officers who took up arms against the U.S.? So he's already starting with kind of this logical question, why are U.S. bases named after Confederate generals who were essentially traitors to the U.S., right? Okay, now concession refutation, we can find that down here, and he actually uses another authority to give us this concession. So one of the concessions about changing our military names, like our the names of some of these military bases, is that we would be erasing history. And a lot of times that's the sort of the counter that you get for things like removing Confederate monuments. Well, we don't want to erase history. Okay, so the concession is about erasing history, and would removing their names erase history? Well, what Samet says here, she's a professor at West Point, an author of Soldier's Heart. She's saying that we wouldn't be erasing history, that ultimately naming U.S. bases after Confederate generals was an attempt to erase history. Okay, so in the early 20th century, there was a pretty strong attempt, mostly led by white supremacists, to rebrand the Civil War as, the war that was about states' rights and not about slavery. So this was an important part of that early 20th century campaign that led to issues like Jim Crow in the South. And so she's saying we're not erasing history. In fact, we're giving a more accurate version of history by removing these names and talking about the reality of the Civil War. Okay. So in conclusion, we have a bit of a look to the future. Remember, I talked to you about that earlier. So names of heroes on Army bases, if these were removed, these Confederate generals' names were removed and replaced, say, with heroes from the past, any kind of past U.S. conflict, who were maybe diverse in nature and gave their lives for the United States, that might be a better reflection of who the U.S. military is today. Okay, so that's the sort of concluding technique here. Now, you want to always think of, and there's a sheet that I have given you guys to help you kind of break down argumentation. Let's come out of here. And this sheet is in Blackboard under Unit 3. It's called Critical Reading for Argument. And it's doing what we've already done here on the board. It's giving us, okay, what's the source, who's the author, etc. What's the claim, what's the evidence, what counterclaims are addressed, how does the author conclude, right? And then you want to think about challenges or issues with the argument, right? And if we were to do that, we could point out a few. The first is the reference to Kairos. So really framing this discussion in what's happening in the world right now, I think would better help Scott Simon's points as he's going through his argument. But I would say for a 2-minute argument, the rest is pretty sound. Other than you might find issue with the way in which Bragg and Benning, the Civil War historian, we only get his perspective about those two men. So you might find that problematic. You might want more evidence for that. But otherwise, he is pulling from authority. This is not Scott Simon saying these things about Bragg and Benning. It is a Civil War historian saying these things. And then he also is using in his concession refutation more research and from an authority. So I think overall for a 2-minute argument, this is a pretty sound argument, right? There's not necessarily a ton of fallacy. There would be if Scott Simon had not relied so heavily on his research, right? So his two sources as he's making his argument. Okay. So what do you guys need to do for homework? Now, let's go to our calendar. And again, I'm sorry today was so long, but it's so essential in understanding argumentation to really map it out. Now, what I want you to do after you watch this video, you are going to listen to another Scott Simon piece. Okay, this one was published a couple weeks ago. It's Congress should do their job so millions of Americans can do theirs. Okay, so this is a reaction to this hope for a stimulus package for some relief because of the pandemic. You're going to go in. I want you to analyze that argument out using the notes like that we took today, or the notes here, the argument notes for critical reading one source, looking at, what is the source info, what is Simon's claim, what evidence does he provide, what counterclaims are addressed, how does he conclude, and what are some of the problems with the argument, okay? What you'll do then is right below the video here in the comment section, I just want y'all to write a quick analysis of it, okay? Do you think it's a strong argument, yes or no, and why? Okay, after you've kind of taken notes on the argument. So post that below. Then for Friday, your homework, you want to begin your argument topic exploration. Okay, so that's the first thing you need to do. To do that, I want you to browse NPR, okay, because the argument topics need to be timely, okay? They need to be something that matters right now and that's in public discourse right now. So I want you to read at least 3 articles from their news tab. Okay, I'll show you what that looks like real quick. And then I want you to read 1 article from Arts and Life or the music section, because some of y'all might want to write arguments about pop culture, which would be fine, okay? So if we go to NPR, what I mean, 3 articles from this section. So when you click on news, you can look at national politics, health, technology, etc. And then at least 1 article from either Arts and Life or music, okay? And this just gives you sort of this wide ranging look at what people are writing about and talking about right now. All right. From the reading that you've done, I want you to write 4 potential research questions, okay? And for help with writing research questions, there's a handout that's linked in here that's, just talks about here's how you can develop a research question from reading an article. Okay. And then you're going to post your potential research questions to the corresponding post on the class blog before the end of the day tomorrow. Okay. That way, when we get in on Friday, those questions are posted and we're going to be able to browse those questions easily. Okay. Don't forget too, we do have a Retlab module this week. It's the argument Retlab module. It's going to really help, especially in looking at rhetorical fallacies, how to, what kind of evidence to use in argumentation and that sort of thing. Whew. So I know it's been a lot. You guys are great for hanging in there. If you need to go back at any point on the video, then feel free to do so. I'm available for questions if you need to run down any of these terms, if you're confused about anything. Don't forget to, in Blackboard under Unit 3 resources, there will be all of these resources listed. So things like how to analyze an argument, those argument notes, intro, claim, confirmation, evidence, concession, refutation, all of that's in there. And you can look at those. What you need to be doing right now is you need to be reading a lot. And as you're reading, you're kind of figuring out what those arguments are, how people are making those arguments, what are the writer's techniques they're using that are interesting that you could model yourself, and then just start thinking about what you want to write. As soon as you feel like you've got that down, you could go ahead and start on the research journey project, which is looking at that different, those different sources and kind of walking us through what your research is saying that you could use in your paper moving forward. So again, no writing papers at this point, right? We are just reading a lot, analyzing arguments, figuring out what you want to write about, researching what you want to write about, and talking about those sources that you're bringing back and how you might use them in a paper. That's what we're doing for part 1. We'll write this paper in a couple of weeks. All right, y'all have a great day.